Thank you all for joining. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Khalid Latif, and I'm the Executive Director at the Center of Pakistan and International Relations, COPAIR, and Program Director of the Middle East Program at COPAIR also. I think over the last days, we have been absorbed over the rapidly unfolding story and images coming out of Afghanistan, which may have taken many by surprise. When I was asked to look into this event, Milton Bearden immediately came to my mind. Today at COPAIR, we are really pleased and honored to have Milton Bearden as the speaker to COPAIR's distinguished guest lecture series titled Afghanistan and America's Future Role in the World. Milton Bearden, during his 30 years career with the CIA, was a station chief in Pakistan, Nigeria, Sudan, and Germany. He served as the CIA's chief of station in Pakistan from 1986 to 1989 and played a role in managing the agency's provision of arms, intelligence, and training, which in turn provided the Afghan mujahedeen fighting occupying Soviet forces. He was later appointed as chief of the Soviet East European Division during the collapse of the Soviet Union. He received the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the Intelligence Medal of Merit, and the Donovan Award for his CIA service. He received the Federal Cross of Merit from the President of the German Federal Republic for his service in Germany at the end of the Cold War. Since retiring, Bearden has written books based on his experiences, commented on current events, and appeared on television, including Secret Warriors, Covert Action, The Power of Nightmares, and Heroes Under Fire. Although generally supportive of the CIA and its mission, he has also been outspoken in his criticism of US actions in the war on terrorism. Bearden is a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and has contributed to Foreign Affairs and to the book about September 11 attacks titled How Did This Happen?, published by Public Affairs. He also serves as a consultant for CBS News. It is important to mention that in August 1999, Milton Bearden argued that the threat posed by Osama bin Laden had been blown out of proportion. He called for the US government to renounce any plans for unilateral military action against Osama bin Laden or for any other cruise missile attack on Afghanistan. Bearden also called for a serious dialogue with the Taliban and said that they have no more, quote, no more obligations to extradite Osama bin Laden from the US than, say, the French do in the case of Ira Inahon or the Israelis in the case of Samuel Scheisman, both of whom are fugitives from American justice in capital murder cases. Following the September 11 attacks, he coined the term Graveyard of Empires, which is the title of his excellent article appearing in the Foreign Affairs Journal to refer to Afghanistan, invoking Afghan victories outside invaders, which had significant political consequences for the invading nations. Bearden predicted that relying on the Northern Alliance against majority of the ethnic groups would create a, quote, brutal general civil war that would continue until the United States simply gave up. Before I give Milton Bearden the floor, I would like for Amna Malik, President of the Center of Pakistan and International Relations, COPAIR, to give her welcoming remarks. Amna Malik is also the editor-chief of the Asian Telegraph and the Melange International magazine. Under her dynamic leadership, COPAIR is engaged on social, political, and economic aspects of emerging technologies, national and international security, digital media. She has been awarded from the President of Pakistan, Dr. Arif Alvi, and the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, for her extraordinary efforts and contributions for Pakistan. At COPAIR, we are truly grateful to her for her encouragement and support. Over to you, Amna Malik.
Thank you very much, Khalid. Honorable Milton Bearden, our guest speaker, former CIA station chief for Pakistan, and our very honorable chairman of Board of Advisors of Center of Pakistan and International Relations, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. I welcome all of you at the webinar. And this is a very important subject, and we are doing series of webinar on Afghanistan and its future and its role of the important powers, and especially US. And Milton, I'm really thankful that on our invitation you are coming here, because you have a very good experience and you can give us an overview in the post-Cold War timings, how US operated in Afghanistan, and then in post-pandemic, and especially in post-Afghanistan, US withdrawal of its forces, and how US is going to keep its influence in the region. And actually, at the moment, I'm out of country and there is some signal issue, and I'm trying that. Hope you can hear my voice clearly. And looking forward to work with you. We have read your articles, and Center of Pakistan in International Relations is always looking forward to develop strong relation of Pakistan with its friendly country. We know the importance of US and other important powers in Afghanistan, and we need to also see that now there are new players, like China is a new player. So how China project of Belt and Road has an impact in Afghanistan peace, and how Russia is going to play its role. And now, in defense and in national security, there is an implication of emerging technology. So we also need to know your overview that how emerging technologies are going to play an important role in Afghanistan and other neighboring countries. And do you think there will be more regional alliances which can create an impact in South Asian region? So we are looking forward to hear from you, your valuable ideas and your suggestions, and how Pakistan can play its key role in Afghanistan peace process, because Afghanistan is our neighbor and it is very important that there should be peace in Afghanistan. If we really wanted to improve our trade relations, if we want to make our CPAC project successful, and we have access to Eurasia, so that is only possible if there is a peace in Afghanistan. And this is the reason US also foreign policy is based on that there should be peace in Afghanistan. We are really concerned about the domestic issues and also the international players' politics. So over to you, Milton. Khalid, Latif, thank you very much, and COPAIR team, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Amna and Khalid. Let me first address a point that you raised from the introduction, is that I was saying that about the US not having the ability to extradite Osama bin Laden from Pakistan or from Afghanistan. At that moment in history, before the invasion by US forces into Afghanistan in 2001, I was in touch with the Taliban, who were, I wouldn't say desperate, but were eager to avoid the coming conflict. They had told me, as a Pashtun to someone they thought understood the Pashtuns, the following on a telephone call. They said, that man is no longer under our protection. And they repeated that 3 times to be sure I heard and to be sure I understood what they were saying. And as we all on this webinar understand, when a Pashtun says that person is not under my protection, he means you must know where he is, just go get him, we'll look the other way. And I passed that message to the Bush administration, and it was clear that they were not interested, that they were in fact more interested in going on into the invasion of Afghanistan, and that in fact did ensue. So I wasn't going soft on the Taliban. I was trying to arrange for something less than a full-blown invasion of Afghanistan, but you can see I absolutely failed on that. Now, where we are today, we can only understand if we also understand some of the history. Is everybody seeing me all right? I've seemed to have lost some video. Do you have my video?
Yes, we can see you.
Oh, okay. All right. Fine. In 1979, the Soviet Union assessed that President Jimmy Carter was probably such a weak president that he might not notice that they would invade Afghanistan and go down in there and clean up their little problem that they had at the time and probably be out before Jimmy Carter could even react if he wanted to react. So on a Christmas Eve in 1979, they went south into Afghanistan. They took it over very quickly, as everybody does when they move in, whether it's Alexander or Genghis Khan or the British or anybody who invades. But then things began to get a little bit difficult. But Jimmy Carter did notice, and he took some quick actions, cutting off some negotiations with the Soviet Union on consular expansion and wheat sales, but quietly he issued what we call a national directive, a presidential finding to the CIA to begin to provide lethal assistance to the mujahedeen to resist the Soviet invaders in Afghanistan. He dispatched Zbigniew Brzezinski to Pakistan, because anybody who can look at the map understands that the only way America is going to have anything to do with the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan is by working with Pakistan. Brzezinski met with President Zia and ISI, and then he took a little trip up to Mitchney Point and took a look down at Torkham Gate, and then took a Kalashnikov from one of the Khyber rifles and sort of looked over the sights of that Kalashnikov into Afghanistan. And that, more than anything else, represented the beginning of the American involvement in Afghanistan following the Soviet invasion. For the first 4 or 5 years, it was more or less, let's bleed the Soviets the way we were bled in Vietnam. But then at a certain point in 1985, both the CIA director, Bill Casey, and President Reagan thought that there was a lack of morality in just fighting to the last Afghan and bleeding the Soviets. So Bill Casey called me in and said, I want you to go to Afghanistan, but with a big difference. We want to win. We want to let those people actually beat the Soviets, and we'll do what it takes, both in resources and in our own moral support for them. So I went to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, and took a look at the situation, and then linked up with what I thought was one of the most capable intelligence services anywhere at that time, was ISI. General Akhtar was heading it up at that time. And we began to ramp up our activity in Afghanistan. We began to move in up to 60,000 tons of military equipment to the mujahedeen through Pakistan, and to fund commanders through Pakistan. But at the same time, I established a unilateral CIA contact with Afghan commanders all over the country. That I think the ISI pretty much knew I was doing it, but they understood that there had been an agreement between Bill Casey and General Akhtar before he died on the plane with Zia that we had to do this to protect our own interests from a very hostile Congress. So we both had a unilateral capability in Afghanistan and working through ISI. And also at that moment, the Afghans were being brutally suppressed by Soviet attack helicopters, and nothing they had were effective against the Mi-24 attack helicopters. The decision was made in Washington that we should supply the Afghans with the US-made Stinger missile, which we did, and the Afghans were trained on the new missile beginning in the summer of 1986. We trained the ISI officers, and they trained the mujahedeen gunners. And in September, or first in August of 1986, there was a lucky shot with a 107 millimeter rocket outside Kabul that hit the Soviet ammunition dump at Karga, which is now by the golf course outside Kabul. And it blew up for about 3 days and was a major setback for the Soviets. And then 1 month later, at Jalalabad, a flight of Soviet helicopters was coming in, and Afghan gunners stood up and brought 3 of them down in rapid succession with US-made Stinger missiles. From that moment, on September 26, 1989, the war turned. At the same time, we had moved through Brezhnev and Andropov and Chebrikov and ended up with Mikhail Gorbachev as the general secretary in the Soviet Union. And he had not personally been involved in signing the document that Leonid Brezhnev used to dispatch the limited contingency, as he called it, into Afghanistan. So Gorbachev was able to call Afghanistan a bleeding wound, as he did in Vladivostok in 1986, and begin serious negotiations in Geneva. So by 1988, the Soviets agreed in Geneva that it was game over and that they would leave in 9 months, which they did to the day on February 15th, 1989, when the Soviet commander, Boris Gromov, who commanded 40th Army, drove across Friendship Bridge, across the Amu Darya, jumped down from his tank about halfway across, and then marched out the remaining 100 meters with his arm in arm with his son, who had met him there on the bridge. And he came home as the hero of Afghanistan, and the Soviet era was over. Now, this is where the problems begin in earnest. The United States, once the Soviets left, I think, and I have written this, turned their back on Afghanistan and Pakistan and walked away from the thing altogether. There was no major aftercare program. Very rapidly, the 7 parties that were the main combatants in the war began to fight each other. And it turned into this awful, nasty civil war that also entrapped our dear ally, Pakistan. Meanwhile, the United States, I believe, and I spoke with President Bush in the Oval Office at one time, was completely occupied with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, which was in fact the end of the Cold War. So when I spoke to Bush in the Oval Office, Bob Gates was his deputy national security advisor, and he reminded the president that I had been running his Afghan program. And the president looked at me and said, "Afghanistan, is that thing still going on?" And I thought, my God, is that thing still going on? Yeah, yes, Mr. President, it is still going on. So we saw that. We saw that civil war all the way up until 9/11 happened. The backstory to Osama bin Laden ending up in Afghanistan is another interesting one. In 1991, he was kicked out of Saudi Arabia by the Saudis, who didn't want him around causing trouble while they supported the US in the first Gulf War. So he went to Sudan. Sudan was the end of the road for most of the international terrorists at that time. Carlos was there, the Jackal, bin Laden was there. Sudan was under sanctions by the US, 2 or 3 sets, and was designated a state sponsor of terrorism. They were desperate to get out from under some of those sanctions. So I traveled to Sudan in 1995, October 1995, and told both the president and the spiritual leader of Sudan, Hassan al-Turabi, that if they wanted to improve their relations with the United States, first step would be to get rid of bin Laden. They came to us later and said, okay, we'll send him back to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis said, no way, we have no interest in this guy coming back. They said, okay, we'll give him to you Americans. We said, no, we have nothing at this point that we could convict him of, so we don't want him. The Sudanese then said, well, we'll keep him here and keep a tight leash on him. And we said, no, you got to get rid of him. They came back again and said, how about he goes to Somalia? He said he'd like to go to Somalia. And we said, no, he's not going to Somalia. And then they finally came to us and said, okay, how about Afghanistan? And we said, my God, that's so far away. Yeah, let him go there. What kind of trouble can he get in there? And so bin Laden then moves to Jalalabad. This was before the Taliban had actually taken over Jalalabad. And so he was tied up with Abdul Rasul Sayyaf at the time. But then later, the Taliban came in, took over Jalalabad, and bin Laden very easily allied himself with them. In the meantime, he's brooding at the United States, so he begins his plotting with some boys in Germany and in the US, and the next thing we end up with is jets flying into the World Trade Center. And so at this point then, the United States has to respond, and it has to go into Afghanistan with a major invasion. As I mentioned at the onset of this little opening, the Taliban reached out to me and said, it doesn't have to be this way. You just come get bin Laden and let's get rid of this issue now. We didn't have any interest in doing that. We wanted to go to war. And now here we are, 20 years later. And what is that? What was accomplished in the last 20 years? Everything has changed in the process. Afghanistan is not the same. Pakistan is not the same. The United States is not the same. Taliban that have taken over in Afghanistan today are the Taliban 2.0 or 3.0. They've all got iPhones. They're all on the internet. They know what's been going on for the last 12 years. They are much more pragmatic and less a bunch of ideologues, I think. But those are the two branches of the Taliban. But in the meantime, the United States traveled with teams into Afghanistan and surveyed the mineral resources. So the question comes up, what could be the possible future of Afghanistan other than endless warfare, 40 years of war or more? And the answer to that is that it is actually one of the last treasure chests on earth. It has all of the rare earths. It's the Saudi Arabia of lithium. It's got gold, copper, iron, the whole $1 trillion of identified assets underground. The Taliban know it, we know it, Pakistan knows it. And if this is ever to work out to where the region is to be somehow stabilized, it will probably be through the mineral resources of Afghanistan, coming through Pakistan down to Gwadar Port and off to destinations. That isn't necessarily just a dream. Obviously, Iran wants to play a game in there. They would rather, instead of it going to Gwadar Port, that it come out the other way and go down to Chabahar. Then China is engaged in not only Belt and Road, which comes through Pakistan, but it has ambitions as well on these minerals. So there's the potential for great competition or even great cooperation. I don't know which it's going to be, but we could discuss that in Afghanistan, and it could be a different situation quite literally forever. Now that's enough to open up the discussion, I would hope.
Thank you, Milton. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive and piercing presentation as usual. I have a couple of questions, some which you have already lucidly explained in your presentation. Where do you think the failure in the withdrawal operation to date has been greatest, besides the overall appeared position that the withdrawal should not have been taken in this manner? And do you think that this is an intelligence failure, a planning failure, or an operational executional failure, or a combination of all four? Because David Petraeus, he just said, I believe yesterday, that we need to acknowledge, quote, we need to acknowledge that we could not win the war in Afghanistan, but we could have managed it.
I would prefer to have heard that from David Petraeus when he was Commander ISAF, rather than to pontificate now after 20 years of a series of commanders ISAF who always testified to our Congress that progress is always being made, but it's fragile and reversible. Okay. Where things probably started going wrong is that there was a failure on possibly all four fronts. Although I've been in the intelligence world long enough to know that if there's a choice in Washington or even in Islamabad for something to be an intelligence failure or a policy failure, guess what? It'll always be an intelligence failure. The withdrawal itself, I think, I'm not sure what discussions, but they will come out sooner or later, what discussions were had with Ashraf Ghani, whom most of us here know. And how is it possible that we had that complete breakdown between the American side and the Afghan side, with Ghani taking off and prompting the complete dissolution of his own 300,000 person national security forces leaving 2,500 to 5,000 Americans holding the bag. People on this side of the ocean are always saying America could have left 2,500 troops in Kabul indefinitely, and they could have stabilized the country because, after all, we haven't taken a casualty in well over a year. My point or counterpoint to that argument is that we have not indeed taken a casualty because the Taliban thought they had an agreement, and part of that agreement was not to attack American forces, and they have stuck to their side of the agreement. If we had announced that, well, we're not going to stick with the Trump-Pompeo agreement with Mullah Baradar, we're going to stay on beyond September 1st, you would be sure that Americans will start taking casualties. So most of the commentary you're hearing from the American expert side, I kind of dismiss, because it's a means of protecting, in some cases, their own performance in the past.
Milt, just to extend on that thought process, what core foreign policy interest has the US preserved in its negotiations with the Taliban in exchange for its withdrawal from Afghanistan? And has the US Pentagon, the intel agencies, the US State Department, have they been in unison with this American withdrawal?
You know, I don't know how much dissent there might be between American agencies. We all saw that William Burns of CIA, but Burns is also a long-term Foreign Service officer. So he's got both, he runs the premier intelligence agency in the United States, but he's also one of our most decorated diplomats in American history. So he met with Baradar. I'm not too sure why he was selected, but that's a point I think we should all look at very carefully. Why did Burns go in? In the last administration, it was Mike Pompeo who met with Baradar and came up with that agreement, but now Burns is going in. Now, your question of what is our future there? Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. It's been a key crossroads ever since Alexander got moving his young Macedonian army, Genghis Khan, the British in all of their failed wars, the Soviets, and now us. So Afghanistan is and was central to that part of the world. And you're the closest neighbor and you feel it in every way, every day. Not the least of which is that you've always had a few million Afghans across on your side of zero line, seeking refuge from the ugliness next door. The future, I think America will stay engaged. I think that the Taliban will want to continue to talk to us. I think they're more pragmatic. This new Taliban is more pragmatic. I have had discussions myself with Taliban about the mineral resources in Afghanistan. I think they want America involved, not just China or Russia. I think that they understand that should be something very carefully managed, or that they will lose a good deal of their own sovereignty as they try to develop that sovereignty. So I can see after a decent interval that we would become involved quietly and on the economic side. I hope so. And I hope so for Pakistan's sake, that America doesn't just say, let's leave the area for a while and take all our toys and go away. I don't believe we're going to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Milt, two more questions from my end, and then I will hand over the floor to Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. We have President Biden, who curiously said that, quote, we spent in Afghanistan. And I see that observers, they like to quote the $3 trillion figure. The question I have is that, is it not that the reality is that much of this $3 trillion actually was not spent in Afghanistan? It was spent on Raytheon, Boeing, and other hardware military suppliers.
You know, it's, I love those numbers. I've heard 2 trillion. Now you've got 3 trillion. Okay. There was a figure that it cost $1 million a year per troop for America. And when we had and we were paying for everybody else. So when there was about 120,000 troops in Afghanistan, and we were paying $1 million a year, that's 120,000 million. Who knows what that means per year? A lot of that went on. There's 300 aircraft that they have now. I mean, they've taken over the entire arsenal. Stuff costs money. Now, I do believe that there was enough money, and I saw it because I spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan in the last 10 years, enough money thrown around to cause great corruption. It's not that the Afghans are more inclined to corruption than anybody else, but I believe if you come in with forklifts loaded with $100 bills and just sort of drop them into an economy, you're guaranteed to create one thing, and that is corruption. Whether you drop them into Texas or drop them into Afghanistan, it's going to be the same. So, yes, there was a lot spent on our own housekeeping, but there was enough spent to distort the situation in Afghanistan in great measurable terms of corruption. I hope that addresses your question.
Definitely. Milt, I also cannot resist the temptation to go back to that eventful day of 9/11 and ask you one question.
Sure.
The very next day of 9/11, you gave an interview to Dan Rather in which you discussed the mythological Osama bin Laden. And then when Dan Rather pressed you on whether the official US narrative on Osama bin Laden was accurate, you said, quote, my gut tells me that I'm not going to go with the first answer that comes to mind, but there's quite possibly something else out there. Experts will jump on you and say it's Osama bin Laden's MO, that he is the only one that is capable of this type of coordinated attack. My answer to them is he is the only one you know that's capable of this kind of attack. This was a tremendously sophisticated operation against the United States, more sophisticated than anybody would ever have ascribed to Osama bin Laden. I think we need to do a little homework. We need to appoint a team B that looks for somebody else. My question to you is that after 20 years, have you guessed upon that, quote, somebody else?
I tell you, I stick by those comments to Dan Rather. To me, each detail, people were ascribing to Osama bin Laden, quite literally each detail, who would take which flight, originating in which city, and how they would commandeer the aircraft and then coordinate it and then hit the two towers, and then actually, except for the people on board the third aircraft foiling them, not hit the third target, which we all suspected was the U.S. Capitol. I don't think, even to this day, that bin Laden would have been able to do all of that. sitting in there in Jalalabad, and to make all of that happen on such a schedule. I think the person or persons who were more involved in that died on those aircraft, and that there isn't somebody else out there that we should still be looking for. I think that, quite honestly, all the people that did what happened that were behind what happened on 9/11 are in their graves.
Okay. And lastly, Milt, I mentioned in the beginning of my talk that you had written a very powerful and prophetic article for the Foreign Affairs magazine 20 years ago titled Afghanistan, Graveyard of Empires. In particular, the ending of that article I was struck with, and it went on to, your quote was, "If anyone is to replace an emir in Afghanistan, it will have to be the people of Afghanistan themselves. Any doubters should ask the British and the Russians." My question is that, will there be a time to come when someone will likewise quote and pen that any doubters should ask the British, the Russians, and the Americans?
Well, you can write that one yourself. Yeah, go ahead. But of course, you know, this, I think earlier in that article, I may have pointed out that Louis Dupree had,
Right,
in his analysis of the British failures in Afghanistan, that he put four reasons that all invaders failed. The first one, taking a foreign army into Afghanistan. That's never worked out well for anybody, whether it's Alexander or the Mughals or the British or the Russians or the Americans. So that one we understand. The second thing is placing an unpopular emir on the throne, and then having Afghan allies mistreat other Afghan groups in Afghanistan. And we all did that with the Northern Alliance and other groups. And the British did the same thing. And the fourth is to not pay tribute to all of the Khans throughout Afghanistan. We stopped, in effect, paying off the old warlord or the old Malik structure of the country. Those were Louis Dupree's four mistakes, and we managed to make them in one form or another, all of them. And so Afghan, it's awfully hard to find an Afghan emir that has an easy time, but I think it's up to them. Ashraf Ghani was not the emir that they needed. He was an American from Chevy Chase, Maryland, until he was Ashraf Ghani until he went back to Afghanistan and decided, well, I better be Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, which he did, and he got, instead of a three-piece Brooks Brothers suit, he was wearing, or actually Armani suit, but he was wearing then Afghan garb, a shalwar kameez, and the headgear of an Ahmadzai. So all of that, those days are over. It's up to the Afghans to put what they want to put on there. The key question for us now, particularly, I think, Pakistan, is what is this Taliban? Is this Taliban 2.0? Is it different from the last time? I think it probably is, in a way of that they're more pragmatists. I don't believe that we had pragmatists last time, or many of them. They also, and you know this very well, they're very clever, and some of them even wise. Americans don't do that. We demonize our enemies, I think, because it makes it easier to kill them, but never mind, that's a personal opinion. But I sense that important dialogues will start between you and the Taliban, because you have to. I mean, Pakistan, I know very, very well, but you're right there. And you have a border with Afghanistan. They don't have a border with you. They don't recognize zero line. And they just, they do with it what they want. So, you've been in the, odd man out for too long. I think we need to stay with Pakistan and help in the aftercare this time quietly.
Okay, thank you, Milton, for accepting our invitation. We have tremendously benefited from your talk, in particular myself. Our closing remarks and vote of thanks will be given by the chairman of COPAIR, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, who is a former ambassador of Pakistan to Iran, Iraq, China, Saudi Arabia, and Mongolia. Until becoming the ambassador, he primarily focused upon multilateral aspects of Pakistan's foreign policy. He has served as first secretary and later as deputy permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations. He has worked as a Director General, United Nations, Additional Secretary, United Nations, Asia, Pacific, and Africa, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Islamabad, a former permanent representative of Pakistan to the Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC, and the Economic Cooperation Organization, ECO. He has also represented Pakistan at several Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. Over to you, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It was a sheer treat to listen to Milton Bearden. His knowledge, hands-on experience of Afghanistan, and his scholarly credentials make him an ideal person to authoritatively speak on the subject of this webinar, that is Afghanistan and America's future role in the world. He has given us excellent historical perspective and also given his views how he sees the future. But I will confine more specifically to what has happened in Afghanistan of recently and what we expect of a US role, not only in Afghanistan, but in the rest of the world. As we all know that America's longest 20-year war has just ended, but at the massive human and material loss and destruction. The war could have been wound up much earlier. First, after the Taliban, which were then aligned with Al-Qaeda, when they were ousted and the threat of terrorism was neutralized, which was the main objective of a US NATO military intervention at that time. Even afterward, there were many opportunities when some compromise could have been reached between US-backed Afghan government and the Taliban, but those opportunities were frittered away, unfortunately. So while eventually US took too long a time to decide that it will withdraw its troops, it took, as I said, too long a time. But when it did so, it withdrew post-haste, without firming up transitional political, military, or logistical arrangements. And also following the Doha Agreement, which protected US perceived core interests, the intra-Afghan peace process also did not culminate in a timely fashion. Because, in my view, Ghani government procrastinated. But in any event, US proceeded then unilaterally without taking the Afghan government or the NATO partners into confidence. So what we see, the resultant chaos reminiscent of US withdrawal from Vietnam and the blame game, particularly targeting Pakistan. So what went wrong? Who's responsible for this? What lies in the future? I think these are the questions one has to ponder over. As pointed out by Milton Bearden in his book to which you are referring, The Graveyard of Empires, it is clearly evident that US is full of hubris and overreach. In my view, whatever be the case, US remains a preeminent power. But undoubtedly, its influence has been tainted. And while US has withdrawn its troops and along with the other allies, but I think US cannot be expected to leave this region for strategic and economic reasons to which Milton referred to. It is a vital place, this region, for United States to keep an eye on China, Russia, Central Asia, its mineral riches, Pakistan, particularly its nuclear assets. So, as I at least do not expect that US will be absent henceforth from this region, but it has to regain its position. And what it has to do to regain its position, not only in this region, but I think even internationally. So I have listed a few points. I am no one to advise the US, but just analyzing, and they are not in order of their importance. US has to show greater sensitivity to local cultures. Of course, it is wedded to Western democracy, but maybe in Afghanistan, it is the Jirga system which is more appropriate instrument of running the government. It has to avoid big power confrontation syndrome. US, as you know, perceives China and Russia its major rivals. Rather, going for big power confrontation, I think it has to work for some healthy competition and cooperation. Geoeconomics and connectivity, rather than military alliances, are to seeing the things through security lens. In this regard, China's BRI and CPEC, and even US initiative of Build Back Better World, I think that is the approach which US should adopt. And also, instead of unilateralism, it should emphasize multilateralism and regionalism, as was promised by candidate President Biden. And also, I think US has to avoid double standards. One hears from US and the Western world a lot about violations of human rights taking place in Xinjiang, Uyghurs, against Uyghurs, or this fear that Taliban might trash human rights, in Afghanistan. but keeping mum on what's happening in Kashmir occupied by India, what's happening in Palestine occupied by Israel. So these double standards, do not add to the prestige and influence of United States and the partners. So that was my views, but I think one has to also focus on immediate requirements. One should eschew blame game and instead focus on reconstruction, rehabilitation, and development needs of Afghanistan. Because this is the best insurance against the scourges of terrorism, extremism, and militancy raising their head again. Freezing of the assets of Taliban government by US and now by World Bank, not the right approach. And also some workable framework for safe evacuation of people who want to leave from Afghanistan should be established. Now there are two Kabuls, the city and the airport. And also, although this problem has not arisen as such, but we have to make some advanced arrangements to look after any flow of refugees and internally displaced persons in Afghanistan. But while I have enumerated what needs to be done by the United States, I think equal responsibility lies on the Taliban. I hope that they are a changed Taliban, but they need international legitimacy. They need financial assistance. And that is only possible if they honor their assertion, promise that they will guard the rights of women, girls, and also international humanitarian law. And that they will not let their Afghan soil be abused by terrorists, and there will be no safe havens of the kind at the hands of which Pakistan had been suffering, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. And of course, this is all possible, and it will be easier to achieve if they have an inclusive government, because Afghanistan is too diverse a country, ethnically, geographically, racially, and so on. So I would like to conclude by saying that it has been a very informative and instructive interaction on developments which are engaging world attention and impacting various countries in a direct fashion. So congratulations to COPAIR, its president, Ms. Amna Malik, and her colleagues in putting up such a wonderful event. But this would not have been possible without the learned discourse of the guest speaker and the active interest of the participants of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. Thank you, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood.
I look forward to staying in touch on this because the game is not over.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Milton. And Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, I don't know if we were muted or not. Again, thank you from my end. And Milton, I'll be in touch with you on a regular basis.
Great.
To pen that last line of yours.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Same to you now. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.